Red Bull's driver lineup has been in a challenging position since Daniel Ricciardo left the team in 2018, but after 5 years of disappointing performances from Max Verstappen's Red Bull teammate, there's more uncertainty of who might take that seat next year, despite Sergio Pérez having a contract in place for next season. So what's the risk Red Bull will take by changing their driver lineup once again? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Red Bull sensing a threat. It's not surprising that rumours have started circling regarding the supposed ultimatum for Sergio Pérez and his Red Bull future. The rumours circulating suggest that Red Bull have told their number 2 driver that if he loses second in the World Championship, then he would be dropped from that team next year. The Mexican driver has been subpar for a large part of this season, with Pérez struggling to make it through to Q3, while his teammate was consistently on pole and comfortably winning races by more than 20 seconds. This difference between teammates has resulted in the 209-point gap between the two drivers at the time of recording, and while Pérez is currently still in second position in the drivers' standings, he's at risk of losing this position to Lewis Hamilton over the final 6 races of the 2023 season. This eventuality remains unlikely. The gap between the Mercedes and Red Bull driver is at 30, and the pair have been scoring similar numbers of points over the last 5 rounds. However, the mere suggestion of the Mexican driver being dropped from the team shows how there is clearly pressure building within the Red Bull setup. Christian Horner commented following the Qatar Grand Prix to say that you can see Mercedes have a pair, McLaren have a pair, Ferrari have a pair that are quite tight between the respective drivers. I think we've had that at the earlier point of the year, but as the season has gone on, it's become more variant. It's clear that the team principal is not completely happy with the gap that has grown between his two drivers. The implications of this are that while Red Bull are aware that they are incredibly comfortable with their current championship position, having wrapped up both championships with 6 races to spare, they could see a future where the team becomes under threat due to their rivals finding a way to improve their cars to match the Red Bull and then have an advantage of having 2 cars in the fight rather than 1. Right now, it seems that this threat is most likely to come from McLaren. The team has achieved 2 double podiums in a row, with both drivers seemingly capable of delivering top performances every weekend. This is probably one of the reasons why Christian Horner called them out specifically when comparing the Red Bull driver pairing with others. Perhaps this sign of a threat is causing this pressure, or perhaps it's just becoming increasingly clear that the gap between the two drivers at the top of the sport is just much larger than you'd expect from a top team. To be honest, Sergio Pérez has the most difficult teammate to beat in Formula 1 at the moment. Max Verstappen rarely has an off weekend, and even when his car wasn't in a normal position in Singapore, Verstappen was still keeping on the heels of the frontrunners and ended up 5th. Verstappen's dominant performance throughout the 2023 season has shown that if a team or driver wants to compete with him for a world championship, they need to be able to compete on that superior level from a consistency perspective. Having said this, the leaps forward this season from Aston Martin in the off-season and McLaren over the summer suggests that if one of these front-running teams is able to make a similar leap going into 2024, they could well be able to take the challenge to Red Bull. Looking at the Constructors' Championship over the last 3 races, Red Bull have scored 74 points and McLaren has scored 104 points. This has to be caveated by the disappointing performance from Red Bull in Singapore and Perez's retirement in Japan, but the second fastest team in F1 right now is starting to show that they're capable of competing with Red Bull with their current driver lineup, and this is mostly being caused by the disappointing performances from Pérez. But Ricciardo remains a risk. The clear alternative to Sergio Pérez from within Red Bull is where the risk lies for the top team in Formula 1. Red Bull has fielded a total of 6 drivers on the F1 grid this year for their 4 seats, with the 3 remaining AlphaTauri options being Yuki Tsunoda, Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson. It's clear that Lawson is not a realistic contender for the Red Bull seat in 2024, but he could be a realistic option with more experience under his belt. Yuki Tsunoda is talented, but his form is often patchy, and so it seems he's unlikely to take that seat either. But Daniel Ricciardo has proven his talent in the Red Bull seat that he would be fighting to take from Sergio Pérez back in the past. Of course, when Daniel Ricciardo last raced for Red Bull, things were very different. Back in 2018, there were significantly different aerodynamic regulations, and Red Bull were not title contenders. Since then, the team have come to the front and developed a car that, in the hands of Verstappen at least, is utterly dominant. So it's safe to say that the environment that Ricciardo would hypothetically be going back to will also be significantly different as well. Verstappen was becoming number 1 back in 2018, but by now he's the clear preferred driver for the team, and any suggestion of Ricciardo joining and being Verstappen's equal, as he did before he left, would probably be rejected. But Ricciardo's journey since leaving Red Bull also adds some risk. The driver that left Red Bull in 2018 was widely regarded as one of the best on the grid, and a champion in the making. But since then, he had an excellent stint at Renault, followed by 2 difficult seasons with McLaren where he particularly struggled with these new aerodynamic regulations. Coming back to the Red Bull group seems to have been a move from Ricciardo to get back to his best, finding a way to regain that form that he had 5 years ago. And this seems like where he's got into the simulator, given that was a key factor in his return to the F1 grid with AlphaTauri. Since making that return to the grid, Ricciardo has taken part in just 2 full Grand Prix at the time of recording before his injury at the Dutch Grand Prix. These 2 races, just before the summer break, were seen as a chance for Ricciardo to get familiar with his new car and then come back following the break with the opportunity to score points and prove himself capable of beating Tsunoda and impressing in F1 once again. That, of course, hasn't happened, and Liam Lawson has ended up doing more races than Ricciardo to this point in the season. But I think Ricciardo will have clear goals in his final rounds before the end of 2023 in terms of outscoring Yuki Tsunoda and showing that he has raw pace and speed in these new ground effect cars. But regardless of how he gets on in these final races, for me, I think there's still significant risk associated with Ricciardo. The driver hasn't had much experience back on the grid since his return, and by putting him in the Red Bull, there will be big expectations on the shoulders of the Australian driver. I believe Ricciardo can handle this pressure. He's got a huge amount of experience in the sport and will undoubtedly be able to perform well in that Red Bull, but there's no denying that his most recent full season was in the McLaren, where he struggled to adapt to the car and found himself well behind his teammate. So until Ricciardo is given a chance in the Red Bull seat, it will be impossible to know if he'll be able to match or exceed the pace of Perez. It seems like only Red Bull themselves will ever be able to make a direct comparison between their 2 options, either in the simulator or in a private test session. And again, until Ricciardo is able to compete in a race weekend, it'll be very difficult for him to prove he's able to be better than Perez. Does Red Bull want Perez out? With this inherent risk associated with Ricciardo right now, this situation begs the question of whether it's worth it for Red Bull at all. The 2025 driver market looks to be full of talented drivers whose contracts end at the end of next year, including both Ferrari drivers as well as Alex Albon, a driver that the team bosses at Red Bull seem to regret letting leave the team. Though his contract actually ends in 2025, the Red Bull team seem to have a continuous link with Lando Norris, who would be a safe bet to put alongside Verstappen if they want the best driver pairing on the grid. But equally, they seem to want to have a clear number 1 and number 2 driver pair, which could make signing a driver like Norris more difficult. Plus, the timing wouldn't quite work for Norris to join in 2025 unless they break him out of his McLaren contract early, which Norris might not be interested in doing anyway. In addition, Perez is still second in the championship right now and is likely to remain there for the end of the year. So it isn't like the Red Bull team are at risk of losing the championship going into next season, where the regulations will remain relatively stable. They may feel the threat of other teams, as I mentioned earlier, but the risk for the top team in the sport remains low. So perhaps the team have just a desire to drop Sergio Pérez and bring Ricciardo in, who is a known popular personality in the sport. Verstappen and Ricciardo have a good relationship off the track, and so perhaps they could work better together in the event that Red Bull are challenged more. On the whole, it seems like Red Bull's revolving door for their second driver hasn't stopped rotating with Pérez. It's clear that Pérez needs to improve if he wants to cement his place in that team for the long term, but perhaps the Red Bull team just need to appreciate that having a driver get close to Max Verstappen is going to be almost impossible.